giving you an update on a couple of the warm water fish species that we assess in Lake Ontario as well as Lake Sturgeon. For starters, as far as gill netting data, the majority of our data comes from the northeastern corner of the lake, from the Bay of Quinte, as well as Ontario's eastern outlet basin. Their assessment has, this is gill netting for their fish community index netting program. There are fixed sites that are sampled multiple times through the season. We also have a long-term data series from New York's Eastern Basin waters. Our survey is done in early August, and we randomly select sites based on a depth stratified design. Outside of this northeastern corner, there's limited gillnet information available in the main basin of the lake as well as in the embayments. And I know Jim will be talking about it more later when he talks about walleye, but there's also, Ontario has a trap netting program in embayments such as Hamilton Harbor, near Toronto, Bay of Quinte, and also along this portion of Ontario's northeastern corner. I won't be getting into any trap netting information today, primarily this gill netting data up in the northern corner. As far as fisheries information, the commercial fisheries in Lake Ontario is relatively small and primarily concentrated in that northeastern corner of the lake. So I'll get into a little bit of that in terms of commercial catches of white perch. And as far as recreational fishery data, long-term data series primarily comes from our DEC Lake Ontario Fishing Boat Survey that covers this area highlighted in yellow. There have been very few angler surveys specific to warm water species outside of this area. A couple years in Ontario's Eastern Basin and a couple years in our New York Eastern Basin. So these are the data sets I'm primarily going to talk about today. For the nearshore fish community, FCO 1.1 is maintain healthy and diverse fisheries, where ultimately we want to maintain or increase populations, recruitment, and fisheries for these species of fish. And today I'm going to focus on smallmouth bass and yellow perch, and Jim Hoyle will be talking about walleye when he comes up. And then later I'll briefly touch on lake sturgeon, our fish community. This is a native species. It's listed as threatened by Ontario and New York. There are two indicators for this fish community objective, one to increase abundance and another to reestablish mature sturgeon at historic spawning locations. So first, to get into smallmouth bass, again, this is data collected from the northeastern corner of the lake in the Bay of Quinte assessment netting locations, Ontario's eastern outlet basin, as well as New York's eastern basin. And this graph is showing you a 3-year moving average catch per gill net. The brown line is for the Bay of Quinte. Catches are typically relatively low for smallmouth bass in the Bay of Quinte netting. The red line is showing you Eastern Basin, New York catch rates, and the blue line is showing you that for Ontario's Eastern Basin. And the Ontario and New York Eastern Basin data tracks very similarly, where we see this decrease about the mid-1990s. This drop is attributed to changes in the ecosystem, reduced productivity, changes associated with dracaena and mussels coming in. And on the New York side, during this period of time through the 90s, early 2000s, we had a cormorant predation issue where cormorants were negatively impacting bass in New York waters of the Eastern Basin. But we've been relatively stable for several years now. Again, as far as fishery data, it's primarily angler catch rates outside of the Eastern Basin. So that main basin waters of New York, that's what this orange line is. It's a angler catch of bass per angler hour from our New York State Fishing Boat Survey. And we've been, for 2014, catch rates very similar to 2013. It's about 0.6 bass per angler hour. And although we're kind of, compared to the most recent years, we've increased and maintained, we actually are remaining at near record low levels, and the anglers would certainly say that we have poor quality fishing on the south shore of Lake Ontario. And I did throw up some of the other recreational fishery data we have. It's pretty limited. These 3 yellow points, it's Ontario's eastern outlet basin, or eastern basin. The green dots are for New York's eastern basin, and more recently in New York on the south shore, we did an angler diary survey among bass anglers, and their catch rates, the catch rates from that survey were very similar to what we saw in our fishing boat survey. So overall, for smallmouth bass across the lake, they're self-sustaining populations. And up in the eastern basin, the abundance of bass has remained relatively stable in recent years. So overall, we're meeting our indicator there. We don't have recreational fishery data, but anecdotal reports from anglers would suggest that they're very satisfied with the quality of fishing in the eastern basin, and they have reported catching very large bass, as we would expect given the increased growth rates and condition we've seen among bass since gobies entered the system. As far as the rest of the lake, again, we really don't have any indices of abundance, but in terms of the fishery data, anglers are dissatisfied with our catch rate, so we're not meeting our indicator there. For yellow perch, again, going back to the northeastern corner gill netting data, I'm going to start off by talking about New York State data. Again, this is a 3-year moving average. In New York, in more recent years, we did have an increase in our gill net catches, and coinciding with this, angler reports of good quality yellow perch fishing in the eastern basin. And our fishing boat survey also documented good perch catch in Lake Ontario's main basin. However, in 2014, well, the last 2 years, anglers' catch rates have gone down, and anglers in the northeast corner have been complaining about the quality, or have expressed concern about the quality of yellow perch fishing. And we actually, in 2014, had our lowest gill net catch on record. Granted, yellow perch catch rates tend to be quite variable compared to some of the other species of fish we see. But when you look at what Ontario's seen for several years now in the Bay of Quinte and their eastern outlet basin, they have been seeing a decline in yellow perch. So there's some cause for concern there. There is a commercial fishery for yellow perch. This top graph is showing you estimated harvest in Ontario commercial catch of yellow perch, that being the green line. They have a larger commercial fishery than we do in New York. And there too, there's been a bit of a decline in recent years. In New York, our commercial fishery is extremely small with relatively low harvest of yellow perch for several years now. And that bottom panel is showing you the 2014 total harvest of all species in the Ontario commercial fishery. Total harvest was about 266,000 pounds, with yellow perch making up about 13% of that harvest. So overall for yellow perch, they are self-sustaining populations. Abundance has been stable in New York, although we saw a tick down in 2014, although we kind of need to look at some, a couple more years of data. Certainly in Ontario, there's been a decline, and as Ron pointed out, for the Thousand Island, St. Lawrence River data, in New York waters, declining yellow perch CUE, and in 2014, the Ontario yellow perch CUE dropped as well. So there we are still not meeting our objective, And for the commercial fishery, again, we're in decline, so therefore not meeting our objective. And moving on to one of our native species, Lake Sturgeon. The fishery for Lake Sturgeon has been closed for a while. In 1976, the commercial fishery for Lake Sturgeon closed in New York. In 1979, the recreational fishery closed in both New York and Ontario. And then in 1984, the commercial fishery in Ontario waters closed for Lake Sturgeon. Now, I mentioned earlier there's two indicators for this species. The shorter term indicator being wanting to see an increase in abundance of lake sturgeon. And if we look at the gillnet data from the northeastern corner that I've talked about with yellow perch and smallmouth bass, we see our catches in the last 20 years considerably higher than catches we saw prior to 1995. And so signs of an increase. We're not effective at sampling them with these gillnet programs. And also in the Niagara River, some work done by Fish and Wildlife Service indicates that in more recent years, a higher catch rate of lake sturgeon compared to 1999 through 2003. The other indicator for lake sturgeon is reestablishing mature spawning populations in historic spawning locations. We do have evidence of spawning at the Niagara River, Trent River, Black River, and the St. Lawrence River. Niagara River, here's the Trent River, Black River, and of course the St. Lawrence River. There are efforts, DEC working with Fish and Wildlife Service to stock sturgeon at locations such as the Genesee River, Oswego River, Oneida Lake. Very small stocking went in at Skinner Creek on the eastern end, and also up in the St. Lawrence River. And for the Genesee population, this is a stocked group of fish. USGS at Tunison Lab has been working on this, and they're seeing good growth, good survival, and these stocked fish are reaching maturities. And similar with the Oswego stockings, those fish are reaching maturity, so we're hoping to see some spawning going on soon. And also there's some artificial, some habitat improvement projects, artificial reef in Black River, as well as the upper St. Lawrence River near the Iroquois Dam. So with that, I'll